David, effective immediately. We're terminating your position as Chief Financial Officer. Security will escort you out. Marcus Webb's voice was flat, clinical, like he was reading from a script. My name is David Martinez, 38 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I was a Chief Financial Officer at Meridian Manufacturing in Cleveland, Ohio. For 3 years, I'd worked 80-hour weeks pulling this company back from the brink of bankruptcy. Apparently, that made me expendable. I nodded once, closed my laptop, and said, "Understood." No arguments, no pleading, no emotion, just professional acknowledgement. Around the conference table, 6 pairs of eyes avoided mine. The new leadership team Marcus had assembled over the past 6 months, all watching to see if I'd make a scene. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. 18 months ago, they were 3 weeks from bankruptcy. Today, they were profitable with $12 million cash positive. Yesterday, I was essential. This morning, I was a liability. What they didn't know was that I'd built the entire financial recovery around systems only I understood, relationships only I maintained, and legal structures that required my personal involvement. I'd been documenting everything for months, sensing this day would come. I walked back to my office for the last time, passing employees who quickly looked away. News travels fast in a company of 340 people. Most of them remember the dark days when paychecks bounced and vendors demanded cash on delivery. They'd seen me work weekends and holidays, rebuilding their financial foundation dollar by dollar. But corporate memory is short when new leadership wants to rewrite history. I began packing methodically. Family photo of my wife Rachel and our twin boys. The coffee mug my team gave me last Christmas with Financial Wizard printed on it. A small cactus that somehow survived 3 years under fluorescent lighting. 22 minutes flat, same as my grandfather used to say about packing his army barracks. Everything that mattered fit in 2 boxes. Marcus appeared in my doorway as I finished, flanked by Tony from security. No goodbye, no handshake, just surveillance to ensure I actually left. "This isn't personal, David," he said, his voice softer now that we were alone. "We just need someone with a more collaborative approach for the growth phase." I kept packing. "The past 3 years speak for themselves," I replied. "Numbers aren't everything in modern business," he said, using that consulting firm tone he perfected. I didn't bother explaining that those numbers, the $47 million debt elimination and positive cash flow, came from relationships built slowly and methodically with 73 different creditors across the Midwest. From handshakes and weekend phone calls, and remembering the names of bankers' kids. Marcus wouldn't understand that my rigid financial discipline was what kept the lights on during the supply chain crisis of 2022, that my outdated processes were why we could maintain operations when competitors were shutting down production lines. I met Meridian Manufacturing when they were a struggling outfit in an industrial complex near the airport. Their product line, specialized automotive components, was solid, but they couldn't manage cash flow well enough to survive market fluctuations. The owner, Robert Kane, was an engineering genius with no mind for finance. "I need someone who can fix this damn money mess," Kane had told me during my interview, pointing to a whiteboard covered in overdue payments and cost overruns. "You accountants understand systems. Make this work, and I'll make it worth your while." After 12 years as a forensic accountant tracking corporate fraud, I knew how to rebuild broken financial systems. Not by cutting costs aggressively, that never works long-term, but by creating sustainable cash flow structures where every dollar had a purpose and every relationship had value. I spent that first month analyzing every expense, every contract, every vendor relationship. Some were small family operations in places like Akron or Toledo. Others were divisions of larger corporations where the right relationship with a credit manager meant payment flexibility during tight periods. By year 2, we had the region's most stable cash flow. When competitors were laying off workers due to economic uncertainty, we kept everyone employed. Our payment reliability hit 99.2%. Vendor trust reached levels I'd never seen before. Kane understood the value. "Whatever you're doing with these numbers, keep doing it," he'd say at our monthly reviews. "Best decision I ever made was bringing you on board." But Kane sold the company last spring. Said he was ready to retire, spend time with his grandchildren. Maybe buy that boat he'd been talking about for years. The investment group that bought Meridian immediately started professionalizing operations. New software, new reporting structures, new key performance indicators. And finally Marcus Webb as CEO to prepare the company for their next phase. The first crack appeared during Marcus's second week. He questioned my practice of maintaining personal relationships with major creditors, calling it unprofessional in the digital age. The second came during a strategy meeting where he dismissed my concerns about changing payment terms with key vendors. They'll adapt, he said confidently. We're too important to their business. The third was overhearing him tell someone on the phone that finance was stuck in the last century and needed fresh blood. I could have fought harder, could have explained that our success was built on precisely the personal approach he was dismantling, that our creditors work with us because of trust, not just transaction history. But I recognized a pattern. I'd seen it during my forensic accounting days. New leadership determined to make their mark by changing what already works. So I started making copies of my contact lists, backing up my financial models, preparing for the inevitable. When it came, the only surprise was the public nature of my dismissal. I shook hands with my team on the way out, wished them success, and meant it. Good people who deserved better than what was coming. On the drive home, my phone lit up with messages from shocked colleagues and confused vendors who'd already somehow heard. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove to Lake Erie and parked in an overlook. For the first time in 3 years, I had nowhere to be at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Congratulations on your freedom, I muttered to myself, watching cargo ships move slowly across the water below. I knew what would happen next. I'd seen this movie before during my forensic days. The first hints were already there in Marcus's management style, the MBA jargon, the consulting firm he'd brought in to modernize operations, the new CFO he'd mentioned hiring to implement scalable processes. What he didn't know was that every major credit relationship was personally managed by me, built on handshakes and mutual respect, not software platforms. There was no transition plan, because nobody had asked for one. More importantly, there were legal complications Marcus didn't understand. Personal guarantees I'd signed during the restructuring. Debt covenants that require my specific authorization. Banking relationships that existed because lenders trusted me personally, not Meridian as an entity. And now nobody would ever ask about those details. Marcus was too confident in his ability to figure things out. The new CFO would be too eager to prove himself. The board would be too focused on growth projections to worry about operational specifics. They'd all assumed the financial recovery was transferable, that relationships could be maintained through professional courtesy and proper documentation. I joined Meridian when they were drowning in $47 million of debt across multiple creditors. Their cash flow was so bad they were 3 weeks from bankruptcy filing. Vendors demanded cash on delivery. The bank was threatening to seize assets. Employees were updating their resumes. Robert Kane was spending sleepless nights wondering if he'd have to close the doors on a company his father had built. The debt structure was a nightmare. Short-term loans at predatory rates. Equipment financing with balloon payments. Trade credit agreements that had been renegotiated so many times nobody remembered the original terms. 23 different creditors with 23 different payment schedules, all demanding priority treatment. The previous CFO had tried to manage it through spreadsheets and phone calls, but couldn't build the systematic approach needed for long-term stability. I spent my first 60 days just mapping the financial landscape, not making promises or dramatic changes, just understanding who was owed what and why, building relationships with credit managers and loan officers, learning their constraints, their approval processes, their personal motivations. Some wanted regular communication. Others preferred minimal contact, as long as payments came on time. A few were willing to restructure terms if they felt confident in long-term stability. The breakthrough came when I realized the debt wasn't just about money, it was about trust. These creditors had been burned before by companies making promises they couldn't keep. They needed to see systematic improvement, not dramatic gestures. So I built a payment hierarchy based on relationship value, not just interest rates. Priority went to vendors who could help us improve operations. Secondary payments went to financial institutions that offered flexibility. Emergency reserves covered unexpected demands from aggressive creditors. By month 6, we'd restructured $31 million in debt and established payment schedules everyone could live with. By month 12, we were current on all obligations and had restored normal trade credit with key suppliers. By month 18, we had positive cash flow and were actually prepaying some obligations to improve our credit rating. The transformation was complete, or so I thought. Marcus Webb arrived 6 months after our financial recovery was complete, brought in by the investment group that bought us from Kane, tasked with preparing the company for rapid growth and eventual resale. He had an MBA from Northwestern, consulting experience with Fortune 500 companies, and very clear ideas about modern financial management. He also had no understanding of how we'd achieved our turnaround or why our approaches worked. His first major decision was hiring Jessica Torres as the new CFO, reporting directly to him instead of operating independently like I had. Jessica was bright, ambitious, and fresh from a consulting firm where she'd specialized in financial process optimization. She spoke fluently about automation, scalability, and digital transformation. She also had no experience managing creditor relationships or working with companies that had survived near bankruptcy. The gradual exclusion started immediately. I was removed from board meetings where financial strategy was discussed. My monthly creditor reports were deemed unnecessary since we were now in normal financial health. My practice of quarterly in-person meetings with major lenders was called old-fashioned and wasteful. The personal relationships I'd built were characterized as unprofessional dependencies that needed to be eliminated. Marcus explained his vision during one of our final one-on-one meetings. "We need to professionalize our financial operations," he said. "Create scalable processes that don't depend on individual relationships. Build systems that can support rapid growth without requiring constant personal intervention. Your work getting us here was excellent, but crisis management skills and growth skills are completely different things." I understood his logic. In a perfect world, financial relationships would be based on clear contracts and professional protocols. Payments would be automated. Credit decisions would be algorithmic. Personal relationships would be unnecessary complications. But Meridian wasn't operating in a perfect world. We were a mid-sized manufacturer in a competitive industry, dependent on vendor relationships and creditor flexibility to maintain our position. What Marcus didn't realize was that our financial stability wasn't just about making payments on time. It was about the personal trust that convinced Bank of Cleveland to restructure our line of credit at below market rates. It was about the relationship that made Precision Steel willing to extend 60-day terms when other suppliers demanded cash. It was about the credibility that allowed us to negotiate payment deferrals during our seasonal cash flow cycles. Those relationships didn't exist on paper. They couldn't be transferred to Jessica through an employee handbook or documented in a process manual. They were built on 3 years of consistent communication, reliable follow-through, and personal accountability. When I called Tom Patterson at Midwest Financial, he took my call because he knew I'd never misrepresented our situation or asked for something we couldn't deliver. When I needed flexibility from Sandra Martinez at Industrial Supply, she trusted my word because I'd always kept my commitments. But try explaining that to a consulting-trained CEO who believed every business challenge could be solved through better processes and more sophisticated software. Marcus had already decided that our financial operations were too dependent on individual expertise. He wanted systems that could scale, relationships that could be managed through customer relationship management platforms, and processes that could be handled by any competent financial professional. The irony was that he was right about scalability. Our approach couldn't support the rapid growth he envisioned, but he was wrong about timing. You don't abandon the systems that save your company until you've built reliable replacements. You don't terminate the relationships that stabilize your finances until you've proven that automated systems can maintain the same level of trust and flexibility. 3 weeks before my termination, I received an email that confirmed my suspicions. It was a company-wide announcement about digital transformation initiatives, including the implementation of a new vendor management system and the standardization of all creditor communications through automated platforms. My position wasn't mentioned in the new organizational chart. Neither was my role in the financial recovery. That same day, I made copies of everything. Not company secrets or proprietary information, just my personal contact list, notes from creditor meetings, and documentation of the payment structures I'd negotiated. If Marcus wanted to rebuild our financial operations from scratch, he was welcome to try. But he'd do it without access to the institutional knowledge that made our current stability possible. I also discovered something interesting while organizing my files. Several of our major debt restructuring agreements included personal guarantee clauses that require my specific involvement in any modifications. When I negotiated those deals during our crisis period, I'd accepted personal liability to demonstrate our commitment to creditors. It was a common practice in distressed company situations, but the legal implications meant I couldn't simply be replaced without triggering review processes. Marcus and Jessica didn't know about those clauses because they'd never asked for a comprehensive review of our debt structure. They'd seen the positive cash flow numbers and assumed all the underlying agreements were standard corporate obligations. They had no idea that several $1 million in restructured debt was tied to my personal guarantees and required my continued involvement to maintain current terms. I didn't mention this during my termination meeting. Let them discover it themselves when they try to implement their new systems. Maybe it would be a learning experience about the complexity of financial relationships. Maybe it would teach them to understand existing structures before trying to replace them. Or maybe it would just create the crisis that would force them to appreciate what they'd thrown away. Either way, I'd done my job. Meridian Manufacturing was financially stable, profitable, and positioned for growth. What happened next was no longer my responsibility. The first crack appeared exactly 1 week after my termination. I was having coffee on my back porch, finally sleeping past 6 a.m. for the first time in 3 years, when my personal phone rang. Tom Patterson from Bank of Cleveland, a number I recognized immediately. I let it go to voicemail. His message was brief but telling. David, we need to discuss the quarterly review for Meridian's credit facility. The new CFO seems confused about the personal guarantee provisions. Call me when you get a chance. I didn't call back. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and waited. By noon, I had 3 more voicemails. Sandra Martinez from Industrial Supply asking about payment authorization procedures. Mike Thompson from Precision still wondering who he should contact about delivery schedule modifications. Jennifer Walsh from Midwest Financial requesting clarification on debt covenant compliance. None of them had been able to reach anyone at Meridian who understood their agreements. That afternoon, my home phone rang. Marcus Webb's name appeared on the caller ID. I answered on the 4th ring. David, we need to discuss some transition items, he said, his voice carefully controlled. There seem to be some vendor relationships that require your specific involvement. I told him that all company property had been returned during my termination. But these aren't company property, he insisted. These are ongoing business relationships. I replied that ongoing business relationships were now his responsibility and hung up. The next morning brought clarity. I drove past Meridian's headquarters on my way to meet with my attorney about potential consulting opportunities. The parking lot was unusually full for 7 a.m., and I could see lights on in the conference room where emergency meetings typically took place. Marcus was discovering what I'd known he would discover. The financial systems he thought were automated and transferable were actually built on personal relationships and individual expertise that couldn't be replicated through software. My lawyer, Patricia Coleman, had been handling my employment contracts for years. Over lunch at a quiet restaurant downtown, she reviewed the termination documents Marcus had provided. Everything looks standard, she said, until you get to these debt restructuring agreements you mentioned. She pulled out copies of the documents I'd signed during our financial crisis. These personal guarantees create ongoing legal obligations that don't terminate with your employment. I studied the paperwork I'd signed 3 years ago during Meridian's darkest period. To convince creditors we were serious about restructuring, I'd accepted personal liability for $14.7 million in modified debt terms. It was the only way to avoid bankruptcy at the time. The agreements require my personal authorization for any changes to payment schedules, interest rates, or collateral arrangements. They also specified that if Meridian defaulted on the restructured terms, I would be personally responsible for the outstanding balances. This is unusual, Patricia noted. Most companies would never allow an employee to sign personal guarantees of this magnitude. But during a financial crisis, desperate times call for desperate measures. The question now is whether Meridian can modify these agreements without your involvement. She read through the legal language carefully. Based on these contracts, they can't. Any attempt to change terms would require your written consent and physical presence at signing meetings. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means Marcus has a problem. She replied. If he wants to modify any of these agreements to support his growth plans, he needs your cooperation. If he wants to refinance debt to take advantage of better interest rates, he needs your signature. If any of these creditors decide they don't like the new management and want to accelerate payment schedules, he needs your relationship management skills to negotiate alternatives. Over the next 2 weeks, the phone calls intensified, not just from creditors, but from Meridian employees who were watching their new systems fail in real time. Brian Foster, my former assistant, sent a carefully worded text message. The new vendor management software isn't recognizing our existing credit terms. Jessica is spending all day on phone calls trying to explain payment schedules that aren't documented in any system. Everyone's working late trying to figure out relationships you manage personally. I didn't respond to Brian, but I appreciated the information. Marcus had assumed that our financial operations could be systematized and automated. He hadn't realized that 3 years of crisis management had created a web of personal relationships and customized agreements that existed nowhere except in my files and contact lists. Jessica might be a brilliant financial analyst, but she had no context for understanding why Bank of Cleveland offered us below-market interest rates or why Industrial Supply extended 60-day payment terms when their standard policy was 30 days. The second week brought escalation. Marcus called twice daily, then hourly. Jessica emailed requesting urgent meetings to discuss transition procedures. The company's general counsel left voicemails about contract clarification needs. I ignored them all. They'd made their decision about my value to the organization. Now, they could live with the consequences of that decision. Meanwhile, I was receiving interesting offers. Word had spread through Cleveland's manufacturing community that I was available. 3 companies reached out about CFO positions. 2 consulting firms wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. A private equity group asked about joining their due diligence team for manufacturing acquisitions. For the first time in years, I had options and leverage. But the most intriguing call came from Robert Kane, Meridian's former owner. David, I heard what happened, he said during our conversation. Complete insanity. Those investors have no idea what they've done. Kane had maintained a small equity stake in Meridian after the sale and still received quarterly financial reports. The numbers look good on paper, he continued, but I'm hearing rumors about operational problems. Vendor relationships deteriorating, banking issues, employee confusion. I confirmed that there had been some transition challenges but didn't elaborate. Kane didn't need details. He'd run Meridian for 23 years before selling to the investment group. He understood the complexity of the relationships I'd built and the difficulty of replacing institutional knowledge. What's your next move? He asked. I told him I was evaluating several opportunities. He paused. Keep me posted. If things continue deteriorating at Meridian, there might be opportunities for people who understand manufacturing finance. 3 weeks after my termination, the dam burst. I was reviewing consulting proposals in my home office when the phone rang. Bank of Cleveland again, but this time it wasn't Tom Patterson. This was his supervisor, Carol Williams, the regional vice president. Mr. Martinez, we need to meet immediately. Meridian Manufacturing has missed 2 scheduled payments on their restructured debt, and we cannot reach anyone who understands the modification terms you negotiated. This was the moment I'd been expecting. During our crisis period, I negotiated complex payment schedules that align with Meridian's seasonal cash flow patterns. Higher payments during strong quarters, reduced payments during slower periods. The agreements required careful management and constant communication to maintain compliance. Without that oversight, default was inevitable. I met Carol Williams at the bank's headquarters the next morning. She was professional but clearly frustrated. We've been trying to work with Ms. Torres, but she doesn't seem to understand the covenant structure you established. The personal guarantee provisions are creating legal complications we need to resolve immediately. Either Meridian brings their payments current within 10 days, or we'll be forced to accelerate the entire debt schedule and pursue collection through your personal guarantees. I reviewed the payment history she provided. Jessica had been making standard monthly payments without understanding the seasonal adjustment clauses I'd negotiated. She'd underpaid during a high payment period and missed a covenant compliance deadline. Under normal circumstances, this would be resolved with a phone call and a catch-up payment. But without established relationships and clear communication, small problems had become major crises. Can this be resolved? Carol asked. Absolutely, I replied. But it requires someone who understands both the legal structure and the operational reality behind these agreements. Someone who has credibility with your credit committee and a track record of successful debt management. She nodded slowly. Would you be willing to facilitate that resolution? I told her I'd consider it, depending on the circumstances. That afternoon, Marcus called again. This time, desperation had replaced arrogance in his voice. David, we have an urgent situation with Bank of Cleveland. They're threatening to accelerate our debt schedule unless we resolve some compliance issues immediately. We need your help understanding the agreements you negotiated. I listened without responding. We're prepared to offer consulting compensation at market rates for your time. Market rates, I repeated, for fixing problems you created by dismantling systems I built over 3 years. Marcus's voice tightened. This isn't about blame, David. This is about moving forward professionally. The company needs continuity while we implement new systems. How much would it take for you to help us through this transition? I thought about Rachel and the boys, about the financial security I'd been building through careful career management. I thought about the other opportunities one was considering, the consulting firms and private equity groups that valued my experience. I thought about the 3 years of 80-hour weeks that had cost me family time and personal health. Then I thought about the 340 employees at Meridian who didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of Marcus's arrogance. Here's what I'll do, I said. I'll meet with Bank of Cleveland to resolve the immediate compliance issues. No charge. Professional courtesy to prevent unnecessary hardship for people who didn't create this problem. But that's a one-time intervention. If you want ongoing support for the transition, we need to discuss terms that reflect the actual value of the expertise you discarded. The meeting with Bank of Cleveland took 2 hours. I reviewed the payment history, explained the seasonal adjustment provisions, and arranged a catch-up payment schedule that would bring Meridian into full compliance within 30 days. Carol Williams was relieved but direct. We need confidence that future payments will be managed properly. These agreements require sophisticated oversight that your replacement doesn't seem to possess. I recommended that Meridian retain me as a consulting CFO for debt management until they could develop internal expertise. Carol agreed that would satisfy the bank's concerns about ongoing compliance. The alternative was full acceleration of the debt schedule, which would likely force Meridian back into financial crisis. When I called Marcus with the resolution, his relief was audible. Thank you, David. This buys us time to get our systems in place. We'll send a consulting agreement for your review. The agreement arrived the next day. Standard consulting rates for 20 hours per month. Focus exclusively on debt management and creditor relations. Professional but limited engagement. I reviewed the terms with Patricia, who pointed out several deficiencies. This doesn't address the broader systemic issues they're facing. It's a Band-Aid solution for a structural problem. Your expertise is worth significantly more than standard consulting rates, especially given the crisis management context. If they want to rebuild their financial operations properly, they need comprehensive support, not limited intervention. Over the following week, the problems multiplied beyond debt management. Industrial Supply suspended Meridian's credit terms due to confusion about payment authorization procedures. Precision Steel threatened to move to cash on delivery until they could establish clear communication protocols with the new management. 3 smaller vendors simply stopped shipping until they received payment guarantees from someone they trusted. Brian Foster texted again with an update. Production is slowing down because we can't get consistent material deliveries. Everyone's frustrated because vendors keep asking for David Martinez, and nobody knows how to handle their concerns. Jessica is doing her best, but she doesn't have the relationships or the context to solve these problems quickly. Marcus called again, this time with a different tone. David, the vendor situation is becoming critical. We need more than debt management consulting. We need someone who can restore stability to our entire financial operation. What would it take for you to come back temporarily while we rebuild our systems? Temporarily, I repeated. You mean until you can replace me again with someone cheaper? Marcus was quiet for a moment. This isn't about cost reduction, David. This is about operational continuity. We made a mistake in the transition timing. We need your expertise to prevent serious damage to vendor relationships and financial stability. I told him I'd consider a broader engagement, but only under specific conditions. First, full authority over financial operations during the transition period. Second, equity compensation instead of salary, reflecting the crisis management value I was providing. Third, a board position to ensure strategic input on financial decisions. Fourth, public acknowledgement of my role in both the original turnaround and the current stabilization. Marcus's response was immediate. We can't authorize equity positions or board seats. That's beyond my authority with the investment group. I replied that those were my terms for resolving the crisis they created by dismantling functional systems. If the investment group wanted to preserve their asset value, they needed to recognize the expertise required to maintain it. The next day brought news that crystallized the situation. Meridian had lost their largest customer, automotive parts manufacturer, that represented 23% of annual revenue. The customer cited concerns about delivery reliability and vendor relationship stability. They'd switched to a competitor who could guarantee consistent supply chain management. That evening, Marcus showed up at my house. I watched through the window as he sat in his car for 10 minutes, presumably gathering courage for a conversation he never thought he'd have to have. When he finally knocked, I answered the door but didn't invite him in. David, he said, I need to be direct. The company is in serious trouble. We're facing vendor credit suspensions, customer defections, and potential bank covenant violations. The board is asking questions I can't answer about financial stability and operational continuity. I need your help to prevent catastrophic damage to the business. I studied his face, seeing stress and exhaustion where confidence and arrogance had been just a month ago. The quarterly board meeting is next week. He continued, if we can't demonstrate financial stability and vendor relationship recovery, they're going to consider emergency measures. That could mean leadership changes, asset sales, or even bankruptcy protection. What exactly are you asking for? I said. He took a deep breath. I'm asking you to come back as Chief Financial Officer with full authority over financial operations. Significant salary increase, equity participation, whatever it takes to stabilize the situation and restore credibility with vendors and creditors. I was quiet for a long moment, considering the irony. 6 weeks ago, they'd fired me for being too rigid and outdated. Now, they wanted to pay me significantly more to fix problems created by replacing my methods with their modern approaches. The company they thought could run without me was collapsing without the systems and relationships I'd built. Here's what I'll do, I said finally. I'll meet with the board directly to discuss terms. Not with you, not with Jessica, not with the investment group's representatives. With the board members who are responsible for protecting the company's long-term value. If they want to prevent bankruptcy and restore operational stability, they can hear my terms directly. Marcus nodded desperately. I'll arrange a meeting for tomorrow. Whatever you need. I watched him walk back to his car, shoulders slumped in defeat. The confident CEO who dismissed my expertise 6 weeks ago was now begging for my help to save the company from his own decisions. The board meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon. 7 members, including 2 from the investment group, gathering in the same conference room where I'd been terminated. I arrived early, wearing the same suit I'd worn on my last day, carrying a folder with my analysis of Meridian's current situation and my terms for resolution. As I walked through the offices toward the conference room, I noticed the changes. empty desks where vendors used to visit regularly, stress lines on faces of employees who were working longer hours to compensate for system failures. The quiet efficiency I'd helped build over 3 years had been replaced by constant crisis management and frustrated problem solving. The board members were already seated when I entered. Robert Kane was there, having flown in from retirement to understand what was happening to the company he'd built. The investment group representatives looked uncomfortable, probably realizing their quick flip strategy was in jeopardy. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, avoiding eye contact. I didn't sit down. Instead, I opened my folder and began speaking. 6 weeks ago, you terminated my position to implement modern financial management systems. Today, you're facing vendor credit suspensions, customer defections, and potential bankruptcy. The systems you dismantled took 3 years to build and represented the institutional knowledge that prevented this company's collapse in 2021. I outlined the current crisis systematically. 14 vendor relationships compromised due to communication failures. 3 major customers reconsidering contracts due to delivery concerns. Bank covenant violations requiring immediate resolution. Operating cash flow disrupted by payment timing confusion. The financial stability you took for granted was built on specific expertise and relationships that don't transfer automatically to new personnel. The room was silent as I detailed the scope of damage. Then I presented my terms. Chief Executive Officer position with full operational authority. 35% equity stake through financial restructuring that reflects crisis management value. Board seat with veto power over financial decisions. Public acknowledgement of my role in both the original turnaround and current stabilization efforts. Comprehensive severance protection to prevent future dismissal without cause. The investment group representative spoke first. These terms are unprecedented. We can't authorize equity transfers of this magnitude or executive positions with board representation. I replied calmly that these terms reflected the value of preventing bankruptcy and preserving their investment. The alternative was watching their asset become worthless through continued operational failures. Robert Kane cleared his throat. David, what you're describing makes sense given the current situation, but the financial terms seem extreme. I looked at him directly. Robert, you sold this company because it was financially stable and operationally efficient. That stability was built on systems and relationships these people dismantled without understanding their complexity. The equity I'm requesting represents the value I created and the crisis I'm preventing. The discussion continued for 2 hours. The board members argued about precedent and authority while I waited patiently. Finally, the lead investment representative asked the critical question, if we don't accept these terms, what happens to the company? I answered honestly. Bankruptcy filing within 60 days. Asset liquidation within 90 days. Complete loss of investment value and 340 jobs. Marcus finally spoke. David, surely we can find middle ground here. Significant salary increase, some equity participation, operational authority during the transition. I shook my head. You had middle ground 6 weeks ago when you fired the person who built your financial stability. Now you have a crisis that requires crisis-level compensation to resolve. The vote was unanimous. Desperation had clarified their priorities remarkably. 7 board members who'd supported my termination 6 weeks ago now authorized the exact expertise they'd dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Marcus resigned that afternoon to pursue other opportunities. Jessica accepted a generous severance package and a positive reference letter. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room for our quarterly board meeting, reviewing financial results that exceeded our recovery projections. Vendor relationships had been fully restored through personal visits and renewed commitment to partnership approaches. Customer confidence had returned through consistent delivery performance and proactive communication. Operating cash flow had stabilized at levels 15% higher than pre-crisis performance. The combined effect was a company valued at $87 million, nearly double what the investment group had paid Robert Kane. My equity stake represented both vindication and security. More importantly, the 340 employees had stable jobs with a financially solid company that understood the value of expertise and relationships. Marcus had found a position with a private equity firm in Chicago, where he presumably continued implementing modern management practices for other companies. I wished him well. Professionally, the experience had taught him lessons about institutional knowledge and transition management that would serve him better in future roles. Last I heard, Jessica was working for a Fortune 500 company where systematic financial management approaches were already established and personal relationship expertise wasn't required. She was actually quite talented within the right context. The problem hadn't been her abilities, but the mismatch between her skills and Meridian's specific needs. As for me, I'd learned that sometimes the best career move is allowing people to discover your value through your absence. Sometimes the most effective negotiation is simply walking away and letting natural consequences demonstrate your worth. Sometimes a quiet man in the corner who knows where all the bodies are buried is exactly the person you can't afford to lose. The quarterly board meeting ended with approval for our next phase expansion plans. As members filed out, Robert Kane stopped beside my chair. "You prove your point," he said quietly. "Built it back stronger than before." I looked up from my papers. "Wasn't about proving a point, Robert." He smiled. "Sure, David. Whatever helps you sleep at night." That evening, I drove home to a house where the lights were on and dinner was waiting. Rachel and the boys had adapted well to my return to reasonable working hours and manageable stress levels. The equity compensation meant financial security we'd never imagined. The CEO position meant respect and authority that matched my responsibilities. But more than that, I'd learned the difference between being needed and being valued. Meridian had needed my expertise during the crisis, but they hadn't valued enough to maintain it properly. Now they had both need and appreciation, which created a foundation for long-term success rather than short-term fixes. I'd spent 3 years saving Meridian Manufacturing from bankruptcy, then 6 weeks watching them discover they couldn't survive without the person who'd done the saving. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just being absolutely indispensable and making sure everyone knows it.